This is Esther, photographer for MMAfighting.com, and I wanted to share a few of my experiences from UFC 193, Rousey vs. Holm. Months ago, there was a big press conference in Las Vegas to introduce all the upcoming cards, where UFC bantamweight champ Ronda Rousey and challenger Holm would first face off. Many critics felt after seeing Rousey flatten Betchkahe in rapid fashion that there could only be one conclusion to this match. If so, Holm certainly didn't conduct herself in that fear. Their stare-down was short and intense, and even though it was for show, Holm had both hands up glued to her face against Rousey's open stance as if the fight were tomorrow. Both women were cordial, but serious. Closer to the bout, we headed to Glendale Fighting Club for Rousey's media day, where the gym's calendar was cleared for only one bout, and the cheese board holding all the microphones was overflowing to the point of collapse. The scrum was enormous. Random questions were just being shouted in the hopes Rousey would hear and answer. Photographers elbowed for room. It was fairly chaotic. For the first time, I didn't recognize most of the reporters in the room. I lost count of the cameras easily, as so many were hidden between others. Ronda was on point. She deftly maneuvered the endless questions about Roadhouse and other film projects, life as a fighter and actress, and her plans to conquer other titles. She was funny and warm. Rousey's hardest shot at the challenger came when she claimed that Holm would not like the exhaustive life of a champion, with all its unrelenting obligations. After the scrum, the crowd got a little more unruly to get that clean pose. There was no more arc of cameras, just a throng of pushing bodies and lenses. She posed against a cacophony of shudders and shouts for attention. In contrast, Holm's media day the next week was a quiet affair over a nice lunch. Holm's appearance was shared with her teammate Michelle Watterson, who was scheduled to fight in December. It was an intimate session with 4 video cameras and less than a dozen writers. Holm's response to Rousey's claim that she would not enjoy being champion was met with a smile. "Oh, that means she thinks I can win." Then, we were finally in Melbourne. Fight week was here. The UFC held open workouts for fans outdoors at Federation Square. Strawweight title challenger Valor Laterna warmed up and displayed a variety of skills. Holm then took the stage with a bounce in her step. After a light warm-up, she asked for a fan to join her on stage where they traded front kicks for half a round while Holm laughed and smiled. The fan was stoked. The crowd warmed to the challenger. As the fan exited the stage, Holm began to do the sprinkler, to which my friend and veteran photographer Dave Mandel said to me, "Who is this woman, and where has this Holm been the entire time?" She proceeded to wow the crowd with spinning kicks and left with a big grin, picking up an earring that had fallen out during a demonstration. Strawweight champ Joanna Jędrzejczyk then lit up the stage with her crisp striking. Then Joanna was joined by recent Melbourne Cup winner Michelle Payne and the bantamweight champ Ronda Rousey. This is a powerful trio, Michelle Payne being the first female jockey ever to win the Melbourne Cup in its 155-year history, and champions Rousey and Jędrzejczyk headlining the largest UFC event ever held. Now the fans lost their minds. This sea of people, some of whom had been waiting since sunrise under hot sun and then clouds that threatened rain, to see the Queen, were finally going to see Rousey work out. Rousey blushed at the adoration, smiling each time a louder scream came through. Still surprised that all this was for her. Her brazen confidence as a fighter did not apply to this glee. Rousey did her usual stretches and throws, then gloving up for mid-session. She demonstrated her striking to the gathered crowd, who grew louder as she finished each combination, pausing to dramatic effect with the right hand at her waist. Rousey took a turn on the mic, where we then saw her raps for the day, emblazoned with "and still." The frenzy continued with an enormous scrum, where this was as close as I could get to the champ without being rude. The entire scrum fans were yelling at the media, "It's our turn!" And then finally it was. Rousey took her time signing autographs and meeting teary-eyed girls clutching a copy of her autobiography. At media day, strawweight champion Jędrzejczyk sat smiling on her stage, in relative quiet compared to the mess of folk around the bantamweight challenger Holm. But most of the media were camped here for Rousey, as was I, recording video for scrum for the site and trying to keep random arms and heads out of my shot. As with the media day before, she answered all the questions with an unshakable confidence, even responding to ESPN's Ramona Shelburne's question about the possibility of being knocked out as an impossibility. Rousey closed the scrum with a plethora of brief bits of advice for the young girls of the world. Then it was time for stare-downs. And while Joanna Jędrzejczyk's face-offs are always intense, the champ told the challenger it would be her last fight, upping the tension. Then Rousey and Holm squared off, and again the challenger kept her hands up high, dashing hopes of a clean image of her face, but suddenly Rousey didn't seem as imposing as she had in the past. It was quiet, but no less serious. After the media day, we had the opportunity to interview UFC President Dana White, whom we hadn't interviewed for some time. It was nice to reunite with the construction of the octagon and the giant screens in the stadium behind them. It's weigh-in day. Jędrzejczyk spent the entire time she undressed with her eyes locked on Letourneau. Their stare-down was a little more heated than the day before as Dana White pushes them apart after their faces clash. They then face forward in one last flex for the crowd. Bantamweight challenger Holly Holm took the scale then, and she was ripped. The champ followed, looking a little more drawn out than usual, but keeping to her signature pose. Rousey stepped off the scale looking for a fight, though, rushing straight to Holm, who was sipping her drink. Holm set her bottle down, trying not to spill it. Dana White tried to slow Rousey's pace just a little as she stomped past him to get to the rehydrating challenger. They were right in each other's faces, closer than I'd seen Rousey face off with anyone before. Rousey got her left hand up high next to the challenger's face, but Holm, a southpaw, would not relent that outside position. In fighting for the outside, Rousey hooked her arm around Holm's and pulled the challenger's fist toward her own face. As the boxer's hand touched the champion, Rousey's anger flared. Holm let her arm follow down. Rousey yanked Holm's wrist down and wound up for a punch while Holm kept her left hand high, face solemn and expression stone, eyes locked on the champ's. I love the shot for the intense blue glare coming from the stage lights. It changed the tone of the photo, and the cocked right fist of Rousey reminds me of the movement in a David Jourdain neoclassical battle painting. White put himself between the two, Rousey pressing up against him trying to step forward. The UFC president then nudged Rousey back as she yelled at Holm. Announcer Joe Rogan stepped in to ask Holm what just happened, and she answered plainly with a chuckle, "I was just trying to get a drink," eliciting a laugh from the audience. Holly Holm smiled, and she said yes, she was here to shock the world. When Rogan turned over to Rousey, the champ stuttered through her accusations. I see through that fake, sweet act. Her voice cracked as she switched from hand to hand, pointing at the space where Holm had faced off with her. The crowd roared. The media was a bustle. We were all taken aback. Rousey had always had tense stare-downs, but her intimidation was always a silent burn. We turned to each other and wondered what all that had transpired meant for tomorrow. The bout would be contested on Sunday morning here in Melbourne, so that the fight would be live on Saturday night in prime time at home in the US. The weigh-ins were done by noon, so we had the rest of the day to enjoy this beautiful city in the spring. We went to the zoo and marveled at Tasmanian devils and cooed at sleeping kangaroos. There were food festivals all over the city. We spent a lot of time wandering through the noodle market, an overwhelmingly enormous collection of Asian delectables. It was a gorgeous day, and the beauty of it all made me even more excited for tomorrow's historic fight. It's Sunday morning, 8 a.m., and young women are buying Ronda Rousey t-shirts in droves and changing into them outside Etihad Stadium, excited to show their support. Inside the expansive stadium, fans milled in slowly as the day progressed. There were good fights and bad, some good wins for Aussie fighters as well. The edges of the stadium felt so far away. As we readied for the co-main event, I saw Hector Lombard watching Valerie Letourneau ascend the stairs into the octagon, careful concern on his face. I wondered what it was like to feel that kind of nervousness for your partner. In the background, Holly Holm's husband waited too. Then, the strawweight champion sped through in her Polish flag. Betting lines for this fight had Letourneau an oppressive underdog, so when she was able to catch a kick and get Jacek down, the crowd oohed with surprise. But the Polish striker returned fire with devastating kicks to the face, all of which Letourneau braved, continuing to fight, refusing to succumb to all the claims she would be no match. It was a gritty fight with Jacek edging out each round, but Letourneau would not give up even as her right eye began to swell shut. Even though this was a great fight, there was an impatience to the crowd, rumbling restlessly. This supposed squash match would go all 5 rounds. Letourneau squinted as light pushed into her eyes. As the decision was read, Joanna Jacek was overwhelmed with joy in such a hard-won victory. As the belt was placed on her shoulder, Jacek looked over with admiration at Letourneau. The champ spun around in a little curtsy, lifting her belt in the air, a violently skilled little sprite. The excitement in the stadium bubbled. Holly Holm had made her way to the cage, and now bad reputation was echoing through the Etihad. The congregation threw their hands up in anticipation of Rousey marching through the horde. In the octagon, Holly Holm did her usual pace from side to side, bouncing opposite Rousey, who stared forward, slapping her own limbs. I was seated behind a post, the hinge for the cage door, where fighters exit. They met in the center, and I was fairly calm until the crowd gasped when Rousey wouldn't touch Holm's gloves, and I didn't see it because the cameraman had moved in and the post kept me from finding another angle. I started to get really nervous. The fans roared with equal parts fascination and disapproval. Rousey backed up to the fence and readied, armed with her scowl. But very quickly, Holm began to land on the champ, and the bewildered voices of fans grew louder and louder. Rousey finally got her hands on Holm after eating a few strikes, her eyes showing a bit of panic as she put everything into getting Holm to the mat. But Holm snakes her arm free quickly from the slick Rousey and throws a few punches on the way up for good measure. Rousey chased Holm around the octagon, mouth agape, filled with blood. And each time she lunged forward carelessly, she paid a price against the crafty striker. I was flanked by local photographers who were shooting their first fight ever, and they weren't feeling the shock of what was transpiring. I became acutely aware of my own short, hurried breaths. They clinched up, and I could hear Holm's wrestling coach next to me yelling, "No, no, no," but then, when Holly picked up Ronda and actually took her down, he changed his tune and started screaming, "Yeah!" Ronda Rousey could not hide her dismay. The stadium was so large that the crowd didn't seem as loud as it usually does, so you could hear the coaches really well, even though the Etihad was losing its mind. My heart was pounding. I felt sweaty and parched. I couldn't calm myself, and I'm not even in there fighting. When the second round began, Rousey gulped in air and came forward in much of the same manner as the first, which made so little sense. Rousey lunged into Holm's strikes, desperately grasping at limbs. She charged forward like a bull, and Holm ducked under with her imaginary red flag. This was it. Rousey stepped down to a knee and turned around with dread. When she realized Holm wasn't there, she did her best to play it off with a strut, but still. She tasted her busted lip, bit the blood in her mouth. Holm continued to tag Rousey hard. And when they clinched up in front of this post, my racing heart was now deafening. I was so afraid the whole night that something important would happen behind this post. But then everything slowed down in my mind. I saw Rousey fall to her hands. I was hyperventilating. And when she stood, I began to shoot. I saw her eyes looking at Holm's, and I felt the kickboxer's leg coming up, and in that split second before, suddenly it felt like deja vu. Holm's leg connected with Rousey's jaw and neck in a most violent manner. A small bit of blood sprayed out of Rousey's damaged mouth. Inside my head, I was shouting, I may have also made actual noise, but at this point, nearly everyone inside the Etihad was on their feet. The air made that deathly silence at the beginning of an explosion, and then it boomed. In the frame after, Rousey began to fall back, tiny beads of blood and sweat frozen in the air. The Titan crashed to the mat with an awful force. Rousey's toes curled. Despite the fast shutter speed, her face blurred as it hit the floor. Rousey's body then reflexively curled into fetal position, though I don't think she was awake. The pain was so evident in her anguished face. When Herb Dean stepped in to stop the fight, Holly Holm walked away, burying her hands in her face, both in disbelief and pure, unshakable belief. She saw it happening in her mind so many times, but at the same time was amazed it was real. After all that wild anger, Rousey was finally at peace in her unconscious state. Holm did a soft lap around the octagon, soaking it all in, but stopped and knelt to check on the vanquished Rousey, who stirred, upset and unaware. As they waited for the result to be read, Rousey stared at the floor. Holm's arm was raised and my eyes watered. This was such a massive moment in the sport's history. Wave over wave of conflicting emotions crashed. It was such a flawless, beautiful fight. The clean technique and execution inspired and astounded me. Holly Holm embraced Rousey, thanked her for the opportunity, noting she would not be here if it were not for her. Rousey's eyes seemed to stare at some faraway horizon, her focus lost in a fog. Ronda exited the octagon quickly, biting her bloodied lip. Even the security staff looked stunned and confused. Inside the cage, Holm's post-fight interview was winning over the previously pro-Rousey crowd. Rogan asked her how she was feeling, and she shouted the best possible answer. "I don't know. I'm trying to take it all in, but it's crazy." And everyone cheered. Her joy so genuine, her accomplishment warming in a way that people had not expected. Holly slowly walked around the cage, still soaking everything in. More tears welled in her eyes. She smiled. I ran into Holm a few hours later in the hotel lobby, and I told her that I cried when she won. It was such an overwhelming moment, and she excitedly responded, "Me too." Holm's coach of 16 years, Mike Winklejohn, threw his hands up in victory as he passed me, looking younger in his bright joy. So many people stayed to see the new champ as she walked back to the tunnel. I'd never seen so many fans stick around after a fight was over. I watched her happy face on the big screen above as she disappeared into a sea of congratulating arms. After the press conference, Ioana and Jacek signed autographs for a few fans, and Mark Hunt asked the new bantamweight champ for a selfie. Holm put her hand to her head in another wave of disbelief and wonder, hugged her also victorious teammate Kyle Noak. There was still so much to process. During her post-fight interview with my colleague Ariel Helwani, I watched her glowing face and happiness. I studied her still watery eyes, glistening in that hard, bright spotlight, refracting off her shiny new belt. The setting sun was beaming through the windows of the now empty press room. Just an hour before, reporters were shouting at the remarkable finish by Holly Holm. Now, I was mesmerized by the creeping line of warm light along the wall and the quiet clinking of the cleaning crew. Inside the stadium, the expanse of white plastic lawn chairs blinded now that there were no live souls sitting in them. The octagon was mostly gone now. I stood and stared at this enormously ghostly space where I had just watched a giant mixed martial arts topple in an electrifying, perhaps surprising moment. But not at all surprising display of brutal and precise craft. And outside, the sunset gilded the stadium, UFC flags blowing in the ocean breeze. So many decried this matchup when it was made, but what's the purpose of putting on a foregone conclusion on the biggest stage? Rousey certainly thought somewhere in her boisterous confidence that Holm could win, even jokingly predicting the exact method in an interview with Jimmy Fallon. Another colleague of mine, Chuck Mendenhall, said in his analysis of the event, "The UFC makes its champions vulnerable at all times. It's in that gamble that the essence of those letters stands out." That golden aura filled my heart. I was exhausted from all that had happened, and yet completely invigorated. I didn't want to work or edit anymore. I just wanted to read everyone's reactions, watch the fight again, to bask in this light that ended this day, and to begin another. This is Esther Lynn for MMAfighting.com, and thank you for watching.